Y'all ready? Yes. It is an honor to sit up here with Stacey Abrams, someone who I have long admired, long revered. Thankful to call not just a friend, but also an ally in this fight.
Absolutely.
And you know, it's I remember when Stacey's book came out, really kind of biography, autobiographical book.
We'll talk about that in a second.
And we saw how many people were moved by it, and were moved by not just the power of the work, but also, frankly, the power of the story about your journey. You know, the woman who sits here to my right has made history every step of the way, and hasn't just made history, but also has made history in such a powerful and profound way that she has led with the belief that this is not about making history. This is about making it that we don't have to make history anymore. Opening up doors, pulling people up along the way. And one of the things I was really moved by with your story, as I continue to learn more about it, was also that, you know, that you got it honestly.
Yes.
That this came from something that was already brewing as you were even brought into this world. And so my first question that I want to ask is, can you tell us a little bit about your parents?
How much time do we have? Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm a politician and the daughter of ministers. You don't want to give me an unlimited amount of time. You will never go home. And that's part of the story. You know, my parents are both from Mississippi. My mom is the third of 7 kids. Her parents divorced when she was a teenager. Her mother actually left the family. Her father raised them, and her father was 30 years older than her mother. He passed away by the time my mom was, I think, 15. My dad likes to say he was from the wrong side of the tracks. My mom's from the wrong side of the tracks. My dad's family did slightly better. His dad was in both the Navy and the Army. His family had aspirations of college, although my dad was the first man in his family to go to college. His family was that sort of middle-class black that's still poorer than poor white, but did better. They owned their home. My parents met when they were 15. My dad says he wooed my mom. My mom says he stalked her. We don't really talk about it too much. But they had this shared belief in the possibility of more. My mom is the first and only one of her siblings to finish high school. She's the only one to go to college and off to graduate school twice. My dad going to college was a big deal because he was the first man to go to college, but that was a big deal in part because my dad is dyslexic. So imagine growing up in segregated schools in Mississippi in the 1950s with dyslexia. They just told him he was stupid. And my dad knew he wasn't. His sisters and his mom and dad knew he wasn't. But he had to struggle. He had to fight to be taken seriously. And even though he went to college, has a bachelor's in history and a second in African American studies, my dad couldn't get a job in an office. He ended up becoming a shipyard worker because his impediment as his literacy was seen as a signal of stupidity as opposed to an opportunity to take this incredible mind and mold it into more. My parents made this sort of co-decision that they were going to raise their children to not pay attention to where we were, but for us to focus on where we could be and to grow in us an obligation to help others get there. So we had 3 jobs: go to church, go to school, take care of each other. Go to church because my parents were really religious, and we went to church, and I share that faith. Although my parents did tell me that I had to believe for myself because they weren't taking me to heaven with them. Yeah, that is a very, very jarring thing to tell a kid, okay? Secondly, they told us to go to school, and they believed that education was transformative. They made certain we lived on the poor street on the middle-class side of town so we could get zoned into the good school. We couldn't get close enough for the great school, but they didn't want us to go to the worst school. And it worked. All of us were able, every one of my siblings, I'm the second of 6 kids, we all graduated from high school, every one of us went to college. Almost all of us graduated from college, and almost all of us have master's degrees or PhDs. And that's in a single generation. But the third thing was my parents said, no matter how little we have, there is someone with less. Your job is to serve that person. But it wasn't just words. They would wake us up on Saturday and take us out to volunteer. We would get really angry. We're like, you know we're poor too, right? Like, we have no running water. The lights have been cut off. My mom referred to our general economic situation as the genteel poor. We had no money, but we watched PBS and we read books. And she referred to any time the lights got cut off or we didn't have food, that was called urban camping. My mom is a librarian, and she's also a really, really good wordsmith. And I say all of that to say this. I was raised in a family that said that lack was not sufficient it wasn't a sufficient excuse. My dad would say having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing. And my life was organized around this notion that my spirit demanded that I do good, that my mind demanded that I learn more, and that my soul required that I serve others to be a good person, and more importantly, to be worthy of the time I had on this earth. That's what Mom and Dad did.
And in many ways, you're talking about a story of it's hope for an unseen, right? It's hope for something that they had hoped, for something that they actually had never seen, had never touched, but they said, but our kids, they'll see it, they'll touch it, they will do it. When you think about this idea of hope for the unseen, particularly from the perspective of your parents, what was that hope? Was there something that they were like, we would really like for you to do X, we would really, really like for you to do Y?
No, Mom and Dad were very agnostic about our pathways, and it shows. My oldest sister is an anthropologist. My youngest sister is a molecular systematist and microbiologist. I have a sister who's a judge, a brother who's a social worker, another brother who's a recovering drug addict. All of us have done different things. And even Walter, my younger brother, who has grappled with both mental illness, he's bipolar, and has a concomitant drug abuse habit that came along because he was trying to self-medicate because we didn't have health insurance. And when he had early onset bipolar disorder as a teenager, we went to a school system that didn't have nurses, so no one knew what to say. They just said he was another bad black kid and tried to put him in remedial courses. Mom and Dad knew well enough that he was smart, and so they sort of disciplined him into better behavior, but bipolar disorder is real. And Walter did what a lot of young men and young women do, and he self-medicated. And that self-medication spiraled into a heroin addiction. And for the rest of his life, he's going to battle that heroin addiction, and he's going to have to manage his bipolar disorder. And that could have been a crippling thing, but what my parents did, the hope for the unseen, was that they knew that even their child who had the deepest struggle was capable of more. Walter went to Morehouse College. He dropped out before his senior year, but his mind was never less than the rest of us. And I think for my parents, it was never about dictating what we did. It was raising us to believe we could do anything and arming us with not just the knowledge, but the sense of purpose that said, whatever it is you do it to make the world better.
And you started working on that pretty early. I mean, you were an activist as a teenager. You started working on bills and policies, I mean, that early. So you were
very
pretty
nerdy.
clear.
Yeah.
Very nerdy. We're glad you're a good nerd. You're a good nerd. But you decided pretty early that this was the direction that you wanted your life to go.
Policy-wise, I did not think I was going to be a politician. I didn't like talking to other people. I was very socially awkward. I wasn't like one of those like weird kids. I just didn't talk to folks unless I had to. I was the person who could get along with everyone, but I was never coming to your party, and you don't need to sit by me at lunch. I'm good. But I was polite about it, you know. But what I would take away from the times we would volunteer in soup kitchens or homeless shelters, we would go to nursing homes, we'd go to juvenile justice facilities. My mom and dad were determined to make Mississippi better, and I'm like, there are only 6 of us and 2 of you. We cannot fix this state. And I said, shouldn't somebody else be doing this? And my parents said, that's called government. Government is supposed to be the intercessor. They are supposed to help provide pathways to opportunity, and they're supposed to help you fix the things that are broken. And I'm like, where are they? And the more I understood about how the intersection of the public sector, the private sector, the civic sector worked, the more I became convinced that I need to understand all three sectors, but that my best use would be in the public sector. That if I could help make politicians better, if I could make policy better, then I would help improve the world. And I tried for a very long time to do it from the outside, but politicians wouldn't do what I said, so I ran for office. And they still wouldn't do for what I said, so I ran for leader. And then I was like, hey, I'm gonna run for governor. That's the way you can't stop paying attention. Didn't quite get there, but every step along the way has been an articulation of my belief that politics is not an end of itself. I am not a politician in that way. I'm a politician because this is a job to get policy done, and my responsibility is to take whatever steps are necessary to manifest the policies I think are necessary for people to live their best lives.
I'm a data person, and I believe in equity. And so your assertion that you didn't quite get there, I would challenge that, but that's a whole nother conversation. But when you think about the role that policy plays in this larger conversation that's taking place right now, what were some of the biggest lessons that you learned on the trail while you were running for governor?
Number one, talk to everyone. I ran what's considered an innovative campaign because I went to places I wasn't expected to go. We have to question the assumption that as a black woman, I shouldn't go to majority white rural communities. But I grew up in Mississippi, came of age in Georgia. There were voters there, so I went to where they were. I campaigned in the area where they filmed Deliverance. I'm not joking. But I also went to Dragon Con, and I went to one music fest. I was the first statewide candidate to march in the Gay Pride Parade. Everything I did was designed for people to know that my ambition wasn't to become governor, my ambition was to serve them. And you can't serve people who can't see you, who don't know who you are. And so I also was very open about my life. It was deeply discomforting. As an introvert, I do not like having all of my business out in the street. But I told my brother's story. I talk about Walter with his permission because I needed people to understand. I understand recidivism. I understand why Desmond Meade is fighting so hard to restore returning citizens, because right now in 22 states, my brother, once he serves his time, can never vote again. That is an abomination in a nation that calls itself a democracy. My brother also will struggle because he is denied access to housing and to employment. And so I talked about Walter, but I also talked about my sister Leslie, who's a federal judge, the first black woman to be a federal judge in the history of Georgia. Because I don't want people to see Walter and Leslie and think that Leslie's a better person than Walter. Leslie just had a different hand dealt to her. And if I didn't talk about both, if I didn't talk about my debt, because I was helping my dad with prostate cancer, if I didn't talk about the mistakes I've made, then people can't trust me to understand the mistakes that they've made and the fact that they still deserve opportunity and they still deserve service. And that's the responsibility of an effective politician.
But you talk about how difficult that is to actually be able to expose yourself to a world like that. And particularly when you have being in a situation where it is a constant news cycle where people are constantly feeding off individuals. That ask for anyone who's looking to run for an office like that is a very real and serious ask of them.
Yes. You don't have to do what I did. I mean, part of my responsibility was that I was so unusual in almost every aspect that I couldn't ask for the suspension of disbelief on every level. I mean, look, there had never been a black woman nominee for governor for a major party in American history. That is a shame, but it's also a 240-year truth. I was running in the Deep South where we don't have the strongest history of race relations. I'm not married, which made people question, like, yeah, I date men, I'm just bad at it. And there were questions about my hair, about my size. Everything that I am is a counter narrative to what people have been told to expect. And so to give people access, you also have to give them comfort. And so some of the comfort is saying, I may not look like what you're used to, but I've experienced what you worry about. I can imagine what you need because I've been there myself. And my responsibility is to put aside my own internal discomfort because the mission of doing good is a stronger driver. I joke with my team, when we have to canvass and I have to knock on a door, I stand there silently praying, please don't answer, please don't answer, please don't answer. But when they answer the door, I'm going to engage that conversation and I'm going to make sure I understand what they need and I'm going to talk about what we can do together. But I still don't want that door to answer. Who I am is private and internal, but what I need belongs to all of us. And so my responsibility is to push myself as far as I can to make other people comfortable with imagining what they can have.
After that, after the gubernatorial race, there's a lot of directions that you could have gone in, a lot of issues that you could have focused on, and I know you probably heard every piece of advice in the world as to what you should do.
Especially from people who told me not to run.
Yes, yes, it's amazing how they come back around, right? And you decided to focus on this issue of access, representation, making sure that people's voices are properly and fairly and legally being heard. Of all the various issues, why this one?
Why did I focus on voter suppression? It seemed timely.
It did seem timely. It did seem timely. But there's a but.
I'll do more.
But there's a specific of voter suppression that we're talking about here, right? Because there is a bigger conversation that you're leading now.
Yes.
That this is about voter suppression, but this is a bigger conversation.
And it's something I've been a part of for a very long time. You asked me about my parents earlier. My parents were both very involved in the civil rights movement as teenagers. They were both born in '49, and so by '65, when the Voting Rights Act came into being, they had just, they were still in high school. But they were both very much involved in the civil rights movement because it was powered by young people. We know the names of those who are older, but the reason John Lewis is so revered is that he was in his 20s when they beat him.
Right.
SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, young people were the engine of this work. And my dad got arrested when he was 14 or 15. He gets younger every time he tells the story, but he got arrested helping register people to vote. So I grew up believing that voting is power. And we saw that power. Power never really worked for us, but my parents took us to vote every single time. We looked like make way for ducklings. Because there's 6 little kids trailing behind them as they go in the voting booth. But they wanted us to see that we don't get absolved of our responsibility to participate simply because we don't get what we want from in the solution. That's not why you do it. And when I ran for governor, it was part of a long history I had. I used to register voters at Spelman College and Morehouse and the AUC. I worked on campaigns. I was a Truman Scholar where we talked about public service. I've done all of the pieces, but the core has always been that democracy is the system we live in, and the core of that power is the right to vote. And what happened to me in Georgia was absurd and offensive, and it was the theft of people's voices, but it was not singular, because it happened in Wisconsin, it happened in Florida, it happened in Ohio and Arizona, and in states where power is shifting because people look different. They are trying their best to use the machinery of democracy to push people out of the system. But when you misuse the machinery of democracy, you break it for everyone. My responsibility is to try to do a patchwork job right now so we can get through the 2020 election, and then to make certain we invest in permanent solutions. Because when you can strip the Voting Rights Act of its meaning and its power simply because you were inconvenienced by the 2008 election, that is wrong. We have to believe that we deserve a system that works, and my responsibility, and because I have a lot of free time on my hands, is to do the work of making that happen through Fair Fight Action and Fair Fight 2020.
And so when people are talking about what is the level of the challenge that we have when it comes to voter suppression, what is the level of challenge that we have with voter suppression?
Okay, so voter suppression is 3 things. It is, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you get access to the ballot, and does your ballot get counted? Registration and staying on the rolls is a unique problem to America. We're one of the few industrialized, democratized nations that requires you to register yourself. Almost every other nation automatically registers you. And we know you can do it here because Oregon does it, Washington State does it, Maine does it. So it's not that we can't, it's that we don't. And the reason we don't is that we create hurdles to access that democracy. And we've been creating those hurdles from the inception of this nation. Mm-hmm. We did it by having slavery, by denying citizenship to Native Americans, by telling women to shut up. We've had multiple ways that we have tried to silence the voices. And the point of entry is registration. And so you've seen some states make it more difficult to register by saying that third parties can't register voters. For those who scoff at that, the reality is for low-income communities and communities of color, third-party registration is 2 to 3 times more likely to get a person on the rolls, which is why in Florida, in Texas, in Tennessee, they've passed laws to make it harder for third-party registrants to get people on the rolls. The second is, can you stay on the rolls? Well, in 9 states, the law says that you can lose your right to vote simply by not using it. It's called voter purging. That is the only right in our Constitution that you can lose for not using. I didn't go hunting on Saturday. I did not lose my Second Amendment right. I may have slept through church last Sunday, but my freedom of religion is intact. But if I decide I don't want to vote for any of these people multiple times, in the United States, you can lose your right to vote. And we're not talking about a handful of people. We're talking 17 million people purged from the rolls in the last decade. That's an epidemic. In the state of Georgia, the governor of Georgia stripped 1.4 million people from the rolls during his 8-year tenure as Secretary of State. They didn't all die, and they didn't all move. And the reality is that when you purge a voter, you're not simply taking their name off the rolls and they can just get back on. A lot of these are people who don't know they are off the rolls until they try to vote, which means they are stripped of their power to participate in the election that they thought was important enough to show up. And a lot of them are dissuaded from trying again. So that's the first thing. Second is access to the ballot. That's voter ID. Yes, everyone should have an ID. This is not the question. Most people have an ID. What voter ID laws do is they restrict the kind of ID you can have and where you can get the ID and how it applies. 2 examples. The state of North Dakota does not require voter registration. Anybody can vote. But they do have an ID law, and the voter ID requires a residential address. North Dakota has a disproportionately high number of Native Americans who live on reservations where they have tribal addresses. The county or the state has to allocate to them a residential address, and shockingly, they didn't. And so in the 2018 election, more than 5,000 people were denied the right to vote because they could not get a residential address that they were not able to have. So you set an impossible standard and they say, oops, you didn't meet it, so your democracy is gone. In Wisconsin, they passed a restrictive voter ID law. A woman who was in her 90s had voted for decades, went in 2015 to get the updated ID. And they said, well, ma'am, we need your original birth certificate. Number one, she's like, I'm 90. I promise you I was born. But she also pointed out that she had been voting in that state and she had a previous version of her driver's license. They said, we need an original birth certificate. She explained to them she was born in segregated Missouri, and that in Missouri, if you were not born in a hospital, you were not given an original birth certificate. Because black people couldn't be born in the hospital, they were born at home. And so she could only get a certificate of live birth, which they said did not count. She was denied the right to vote in 2016. Restrictive voter ID says that you are not enough, and it is an intentional filter to push people out of the process. Then there's poll closures. Since the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 1,688 polling places have closed down. Again, sounds innocuous. You can vote in different ways. Well, let's say you live in a rural county like Clay County, Georgia, where there's now only 1 polling place. There is no public transportation, and you got a lot of poor people with no cars. If the polling place isn't a mile away, it's now 10 miles away or 20 miles away, you cannot vote. And the analysis done by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in Georgia alone shows that the 214 polling places shut down under Brian Kemp led to between 50 and 60,000 people being unable to cast a ballot in the 2018 election. And just by comparison, I lost by 54,723 votes, not that anyone's counting. Then it's early voting. In North Carolina, early voting was one of the reasons that Barack Obama won in 2008. Same thing in Florida. Well, once there was a Republican sweep of those states, they shut down or restricted access to early voting, because who uses early voting? People who are shift workers, people who are low income, because they don't have the time to take off on election day, so they might need to go on a Saturday or a Sunday, or they might be able to go after work one day. Well, when you restrict the access to those early voting centers, you restrict their ability to vote, and that's happening across the country. The last thing is, does your vote count, otherwise known as Florida? So that one is, if you, let's say you get an absentee ballot, you fill it out, you send it in. In Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Iowa, and a handful of other states, there's something called a signature match. So you sign the back of your absentee ballot, you send it in. When a lot of these states, they require your signature to match the signature they have on file from the first time you register. My signature doesn't match from CVS to Kroger. And yet this is used as a predicate for throwing out thousands of ballots across the country. And in a state like Florida, where elections are won and lost by 500 votes, 5,000 votes, throwing out someone's signature, especially among the elderly, who tend to have very different handwriting as they age, that is voter suppression. So it's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast your ballot? And does your ballot get counted? That's voter suppression, happens everywhere. It looks like administrative errors, it looks like rules, but what it is an intentional diminution of the right to access democracy in America, and it's wrong, and we should stop it.
So you talked about what some of the long-term goals are. For the short term, for 2020, what does success look like? What are those goals?
So I like to say that in the 10-day period between Election Day and my non-concession day was November 16th, when I acknowledged the legal sufficiency of the election. I do not think I'm the governor. I acknowledge the legal sufficiency of the election, but I refuse to condone the legitimacy of a system that can steal the right to vote from thousands of people, whether they were going to vote for me or not. But in between that period, I had a lot of time to think. I went through all the stages of grief. I found a new stage that I call plotting. And I started manufacturing the things I could do. And so what I thought about was, what work could I do even if I wasn't the governor? And the short term is that we can fix some of the vestiges of voter suppression as they exist today. It's a systems issue. If you watched Iowa last week and freaked out, don't. It was a systemic problem, because the same thing that happened in Iowa last week happened in Iowa in 2012. But if you were a Democrat, you didn't care because you weren't paying attention. And if you were a Republican, they were just much better about not mentioning it. And they told Rick Santorum 3 weeks later, after he dropped out, oh, by the way, you won Iowa, congratulations on your momentum. But the system is what's broken. And so you have to fix the systems, and that's what we do through Fair Fight 2020. We are in 18 battleground states around the country. We have put in place full teams. We'll have them all in place by the end of this month, I believe. Full teams of voter protection directors, deputy directors, field organizers, and hotline managers, so that in every state you can protect the right to vote. And here's why this matters. Typically, we don't think about voter suppression until September of an election year. By September, it's too late. At that point, you're doing triage. We have to do anticipation. And we are using all of the presidential primaries to test the systems. Because voter suppression happens year-round, we just don't notice it until it affects us. But if we can anticipate it, then we can start pushing back on it. But I'm also part of a group of folks who are funding lawsuits around the country, because we also need to sue people into better behavior. We may not be able to fundamentally fix the system until we restructure and have a functional Senate and a functional White House, but we can hold states to higher standards. Because the thing we have to remember with voter suppression is that we don't have a single democracy in America. We have 50 different democracies, which means the rules look different. The categories are the same, but the rules are different in every single state. And so in the 20 states, we did 3 during, we did Kentucky and Louisiana in 2019. Everyone else we've carried through, so we have 18 states for 2020. But in all of those states, we are going to be on the ground now, preparing for voter suppression, preparing to fight back and to raise alerts. Because if you can mitigate it, you change the outcome of every election. If you solve it, we actually have a functioning democracy once again.
And Dr. King talked about this two-headed task that we have to take on. One is we have to protect the right to vote. Mm-hmm. And the second task is we have to give people something worth voting for. Can you talk a little bit about the second piece?
That's why I believe in policy. My favorite speech by Dr. King is March on Ballot Boxes. He gave it in May of 1966. And what he said is, look, it wasn't enough for us to get this right. If we don't use it, they will take it.
Yes.
And what he wanted it to be used for is to solve the problems that you all focus on. Poverty is immoral, it is economically inefficient, and it is solvable. And all of the policies that we can promote, like making sure that from 0 to 3, children have access to high quality early learning so that they're prepared for kindergarten, so that they don't drop out by 3rd grade, that the investments we can make in affordable housing so that families have stability and the ability to grow, that we solve the banking crisis for returning citizens. If you think it's hard for you to bank, imagine if you've been in prison and you're trying to re-enter society. Can you get a house? Can you get a checking account? It's thinking about transportation. Those are the things that I think we should be talking about. I don't like the current president, but he's not the problem, he's the symptom. Our obligation is to focus on the problem and the solution. And the solution are better policies that create opportunity. And in every state, those opportunities look different, and the barriers to opportunity looks different. And so my responsibility and the why of it, the reason people vote, is when you tell them that you are willing to work with them to find solutions. Most people don't want you to fix their lives. They want you to give them the tools they need to let them fix their lives themselves.
And stop putting the barriers up in front that make them forced to actually fix something.
Exactly.
Do you think that as a party, as a country, that we have really fortified and solidified the argument yet? Or do you think that we still have work to do to really help to explain that to the American people?
The challenge is that often the Democratic Party, of which I'm a part, is compared to the Republican Party. And the difference is that because our party focuses on diagnosis, there is no reductive answer because the problem differs depending on where you are and where you sit. And if we try to do a reductive answer, then someone's not going to hear their problem. But more importantly, they're going to think you're glossing over it or you don't care. Our responsibility is not to necessarily have a pat, pithy answer that can fit on a bumper sticker. Our responsibility is to show through practice that we have solutions that can make their lives better. I will vote for someone because they tell me they understand me before I'll vote for someone who makes me want to go drinking with them. Because I don't need you drunk, I need you working.
That's right. How long do you think that this contest of ideas actually lasts and goes? Does it go all the way to a convention, or do you think?
Oh, the primary, okay.
Yeah.
Primaries are necessary. They are it's like going to the dentist. No one enjoys it. Sometimes you go in and it's for cleaning, sometimes it's a root canal. Apparently we're in root canal stage. But at the end of the day, we're going to be better off for it. We are in a moment in our history where we are in inflection points for the economy, for race, for identity writ large. We are changing as a country in ways that we have not seen in modern times. And that is deeply unsettling. And we're going to debate how we deal with it. But I want to point out to everyone that there's not a person in this debate who doesn't want more for our country and more for our people. And there's not a person in this debate who is building their legacy on the demonization and dehumanization of the very citizens they serve. And therefore, no matter who that person is, it's not just that they're better than the current occupant of the White House, it's that they're a better person than the current occupant of the White House. And I want a good person to be our leader. These are people who are going to have made mistakes. They will have made terrible mistakes, bad mistakes, mediocre mistakes, and they're going to screw up again. So let's just be clear. For all the apologies we get and all the atonement we demand, they're going to do something much worse. By accident or on purpose. But what we want are people who understand that redemption is possible, but only if you are accountable, only if you're willing to work to be better. That should be our metric, that should be our standard, and that's what I look for.
From I'll bring it back to you and your process, how you think about the decisions that you make, the paths that you go down. What has been your process when you think about the things and decisions that you make, and what is your process now about how that then will influence what you then choose to do next and what you focus on next?
So I'm deeply anal retentive. My mom laughs about the fact that when we were little, my older sister taught us to do our Christmas list. We used to have the Sears Wish Book. If you're under 40, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But we would get the Sears Wish Book, and it was, that the day it arrived meant that Christmas was soon to come. We did not quite correlate why Santa Claus would require a wish book, but it just seemed an important thing. In our family, we would itemize our Christmas list by listing the page in the wish book, the price point, and the secondary item if we couldn't have that one. Because we also knew we were broke. But we didn't quite conceptualize it that way, but I grew up making lists. When I was in college, I made a list of all of my ambitions that I've put on a spreadsheet and I've maintained for one of those years. And I try my best to be intentional about my goals, good or bad. And that means giving myself space to investigate, to experiment, and then to correct. And you mentioned my book at the beginning. I didn't want to write a memoir. I wanted to write a how-to guide. But apparently you need to tell people how you've messed up too, so it became autobiographical. But it was cathartic for me, in part because I want people to understand just how badly I've messed up on, I was able to fill a whole book with this stuff. And it was important to me because we think of leadership as perfection. Leadership is strongest when it's been tested and when you have failed and had to recover. That's how America gets stronger, when we make grotesque mistakes about the humanity of our people, and then we repent and we try to do better. One of the pieces I'm working on now is called Fair Count. So I thought about how do we fix our democracy, and one piece we don't pay attention to is the US Census. It happens every 10 years, we get a little annoyed by it, most of us don't even remember filling it out, and we go on about our day. But the census allocates $1.5 trillion a year. And for the communities of color that we expect not to respond, they will forfeit $8.2 billion every year. $3.3 billion if you're Black, $4.4 billion if you're Latino, 590 million if you're Asian, and 200 million if you're Native American. Those are dollars that don't go into classrooms, don't go into healthcare, don't go into businesses. Those are real dollars that depress our communities. And so when I thought about what to do with my aftermath, fair fight was one piece, but fair count was a necessary part because we have to count these communities because it's also how we allocate political power for a decade. And in this upcoming decade, because of the inflection point that we're at demographically, if communities of color, if immigrants, if children are not counted, the consequences aren't 10-year consequences, they are generational consequences. And so I started an organization that is one of only 2 organizations that we can find in the country that does nothing but make sure hard-to-count communities are going to be counted in the census in 2020. The third thing I did was start an organization that translates public policy into Southern. Because you hear about all this progressive policy out there, congratulations to all of you, that does not fly where I live. And it's not that we don't want more, but the structure of government is different. The structure of policymaking is different. The structure of the problem is different. When you come from a place that began with slavery as the core of the economy, that shifted into sharecropping and then became a service economy, there are parts to how we think about progress and solutions that have to be translated into the nature of who we are, where we are. And for me, each of those decisions have come about by thinking, what can I do? What can I create that can be done without me? And what is the next problem that we have to think about? I try to live my life anticipating the next problem. I like to say I am not an optimist, I'm not a pessimist, I'm an ameliorist. Ameliorating, means to mitigate the harm. I believe the glass is half full, it's just probably poisoned. My job in life is to find the antidote, and that's what I do.
So I have one final question. I look amongst this crowd here, and these are all folks who are partners with us in the work in every definition of the word partner. We have frontline community organizers. We have people who are leading direct service organizations. We have philanthropists. There are policymakers. I mean, this whole crowd is full of people who are actively in the work every single day. And they know, as you know, and as I know, some days are harder than others.
Absolutely.
And it seems like frequently the harder days are coming fast. What do you have to say to yourself in those hard days to keep you up and going and moving forward, knowing that those wins are still coming?
My great-grandmother, my dad's grandmother, we called her Moo Moo. And she lived in this tiny house next to my grandparents' house. Moo Moo would let us come, when we'd come to visit her, we would watch the Dodgers play on the radio. She didn't like the newfangled television because she had never gotten to watch a baseball game. She'd grown up listening to it. Moo Moo would have us shell peas with her, and we would listen to her tell stories of her childhood. Moo Moo's grandparents were slaves. Her parents were sharecroppers. And she would talk to us about where she had come from. I had the privilege in 2018 to stand in a place that very few people get to stand, and no Black woman had stood before. I get invited into conversations these days about what I'm going to do depending on who the nominee for president is. And I get a little bit of pushback because I say I would be honored to be their running mate, and people get upset and they're like, well, you shouldn't say that. And my answer is, I stand in the space of every woman of color, every Black woman, every Black child who has been told not to dream. In the space of every poor person who has been told their ambition is too much because you're never gonna get out of here. I get through the hard days by remembering where I came from and knowing that in a single generation, what my parents were able to produce is not endemic only to us. What my parents did for us can be done for so many, but not everyone has Robert and Carolyn Abrams as their parents. My responsibility is not to be weary. My responsibility is to be in loco parentis for those people who needed Robert and Carolyn. They imbued into me what is possible, and my job is to deliver it to others, and that gets me up the next day.
And we thank God that you keep on getting up.
Well, thank you.
Friends and family, Stacey Abrams.
Thank you.